So let's move to the progressive mind of Corey Robin and talk about his latest piece on the question of impeachment and what it could mean. What is the thesis of this piece?
I mean, the basic thesis is simple, that impeachment could be, and sometimes in the past has been, a way that a party essentially repudiates and helps destroy an existing regime. And I think the classic example is the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. The Republican Party had led the effort to emancipate, to abolish slavery. And Andrew Johnson really, at the end of the Civil War, wanted to kind of drag it back and stop that. And the Republican Party decided that, they weren't going to have it. And he was impeached. He was acquitted by one vote. But essentially at that point, even though he remained in power, the Republican Party, the congressional Republicans, took over the process. And that's where, you really get radical reconstruction. And so in theory, what we could have right now is if the Democratic Party were serious about repudiating the Reagan regime, the neoliberal regime, this would be a great opportunity. Unlike the first impeachment of Trump, which was very much a kind of very narrow, technical, whole set of issues that, involve. Let's set that aside. What happened on January the 6th, whatever word you want to use for it, I think that, a good part of the Republican Party revealed its hand as being hostile, fundamentally hostile to I wouldn't say the reality, but to the promise of a multiracial democracy. And this is a signal, for a real political party to then say, if that's where you stand and if you're going to use illegal methods to preserve that, you have forsaken, you have sacrificed, you have betrayed your right to rule. And you will no longer be in a position to do that. And we are going to fundamentally transform the terms and categories of American politics in order to permanently keep this kind of politics out. Not these people, but this kind of politics. We are going to repudiate it. And that's what an impeachment could be. That's not, of course, what the Democratic Party really wants to do. That decision was already made when they decided not to nominate Bernie Sanders. And so we are going to have, not quite that. But I thought it was important not to be neither a cheerleader nor a cynic about impeachment, to say that there is a promise of what it could be, but also to point out that it's, more than likely that is not what it's going to be.
And what did you think? So you wrote this before, right? The impeachment. What did you think of the impeachment? You mentioned the promise of impeachment. How fulfilled was that, or was that not?
I mean, I should also say, we are not yet in a position to have a realignment and a kind of repudiation of the Reagan regime. And even though Trump has now been impeached for a second time, and I'll say something more about that in a second, the process whereby this repudiation realignment is going to happen is going to be over a period of years. I think what's more interesting, frankly, is not from the Democratic point of view, but what this is going to do to the Republican Party. I think that's the more interesting question. But that's where we are.
In your piece, you quote your book, The Reactionary Mind. Over the last 4 years, I've argued that this is a potential moment of realignment where the Reagan regime we've been living under could be shattered and repudiated and replaced by a new political regime. One of the reasons I press so hard on the Trump-Carter comparison is to point out that the Reagan regime, like the New Deal regime in the 1970s, is more vulnerable than we realize. I continue to maintain that Trump's inability to rule, most spectacularly put on display this past week, reflects the crumbling power of that regime. That doesn't mean the regime can't do damage on its way out. The last sentence of The Reactionary Mind makes a point of saying how much the Reagan regime will take with it on its way out remains to be seen, but that regime is far weaker than at any point since its inception. That's a kind of controversial thing to say for many people, right? And last week I had a debate on fascism with Jason Stanley, Jody Dean, Eugene Puryear, Daniel Bessner, and Samuel Moyn. And I often think of you and Samuel Moyn as making somewhat similar arguments. Mm-hmm. So can you explain to people what you mean about how it's weakened and how Trump had an inability to rule and at the same time did damage?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the first thing is to look at Trump's presidency in historical perspective. And by that, I mean in comparison to Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and George W. Bush. On a whole bunch of measures, there is just no doubt that the Trump presidency was relative to those presidencies, far weaker. Number one, in terms of the level of support, popular support that he had going in. It was the lowest level of popular support of any of these presidents. And remember, those other three were reelected. And in the case of Nixon and Reagan, in landslide elections. Trump, of course, was not. Second, if you look at the actual things that he managed to do in terms of getting a program through Congress, with the exception of the tax cuts, he was an extraordinarily weak leader. And not just on, certain kind of Republican issues, but on some signature Trump issues. So he was never able to get an immigration bill through Congress, even when his own party controlled the entire Congress. He was never able to get his Congress to pay for a wall, again, even when his own party was able to. And you could just go through, I mean, I don't want to bore all your readers, and I've written about this a ton, but, it's just after thing after thing after thing. Where he was successful was in the appointment of judges, which has always been, the thing that a lot of, McConnell types have cared the most about. In fact, it's Mitch McConnell who made those judges happen. But in terms of advancing the Republican Party agenda, he was actually singularly ineffective. And so I think on the one hand, you have to really look at that kind of weakness in terms of creating hegemony over the electorate. And a quote I often like to use is from Margaret Thatcher. After she retired, she was asked, what do you think is your greatest achievement? And without missing a beat, she said, Tony Blair. And what did she mean by that? She meant it was her ability to impose her will and the Tory vision, not on their own party. Right. But on the opposition party. That was what was the truly transformative impact. And that is what Nixon, Reagan, and Bush did. Trump, and this is no brief for the Democrats, but what is amazing about Trump is how much, in fact, the Democratic Party consistently opposed him, even on the tax cuts. I mean, Reagan got over 150 Democrats to vote for his tax cuts. Bush got about 40 Democrats. Trump got 0 Democrats to vote. So, and there's a whole bunch of other things. So all those are the measures of his weakness. However, and I think this is what people come back to, it is no doubt that he was able to inflict damage, tremendous damage, material damage, on a host of communities, on a host of regulations, and all the rest of it. And that is true. And so if the question was, is he, a damaging president? Is he a cruel president? There was never a question. But I think it was really important for people to get very clear that as, viewed in historical perspective, this is a political movement that is extraordinarily weak. And nothing that happened on January 6th changes that fact. There was no chance that they were going to be able to reverse the outcome of that election. And there's nothing to suggest that Trump or the Republican Party have improved their standing since what happened on January 6th. Quite the opposite. What that means long term, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. But I think, it's just
What about
very
a Sagar
important.
and Jetty?
Say again?
What about a Sagar and Jetty? I'm sorry, I couldn't resist the crystal ball joke. I'm very sorry, yeah. The rising joke, yeah.
Get it. So anyway, but that's kind of where I fall out on that question.
Sorry, I cut you off. You don't have a crystal ball, but any suspicions or?
Well, I mean, I think the Republican Party is in for a very tough reckoning. I think, it's been very clear, it was very clear from the moment that Trump was nominated that he was a bad candidate. He was going to be a weak leader, but that he was also the best the Republican Party could do. And I hesitate to make predictions on this one. But my sense is that, there's going to be a real falling out within them because it's not clear who's going to inherit his mantle. I don't think they can do much better than he. I think they're in for a pretty rough patch.
It's interesting because when you said that, Margaret Thatcher's greatest achievement was Tony Blair, it reminds me a bit of the way that Trump's greatest achievement was, or maybe the Dems' greatest achievement was Donald Trump in a way, right? Because, to the extent that the Democrats helped create the conditions that led to Trump, now what they've been able to do, right, is that has so shifted the Overton window in terms of not just policy, but obviously aesthetic and rhetoric, that now they're just able to oppose Trump. That's what they've been able to do, right? Sign on to his war budgets, give him all the money he wants for the military, for the Pentagon, say that he's a deranged Cheeto Mussolini, also urge him to be more belligerent with Putin, which never made any sense. But I wonder if that is, it is this kind of, I'm imagining, remembering that photo of the Clintons with Trump. But, this does seem like a very good move for class warfare.
Right. Yeah, I mean, just when you said that about the Democrats complaining that he's a Mussolini, and then complaining that he doesn't be more belligerent with Putin, that's that old joke, the Jewish couple, complaining about a restaurant, and they're like, the food's so bad, and the other one says, yeah, and the portions are so small,
right?
And that's always seemed to me to be this weird left, kind of split response. I think the bigger question is, how good has Trump been for the Democrats? I think he's actually been quite good, but I would sort of spin it in a slightly different direction. Because, you mentioned budgets. If you look at the budgets that Donald Trump passed, and I won't, let's set the military to one side for a second. The truth of the matter is that they were more liberal in many ways than Barack Obama's budgets. He had very little, which is not that Barack Obama was so progressive or liberal himself, but they, when it came to kind of core Democratic programs, there was just a piece in the New York Times or the Washington Post, remember all that, the liberals got very, nervous. He's going to abolish the National Endowment of Arts. Right. Well, of course, he not only did not, they increased spending on the National Endowment of Arts. They never, increased spending on Planned Parenthood. There's been a whole bunch of things, kind of culture war sorts of issues, where he and the Republicans have spent like Democrats. So, I think to that extent, actually, he's been good for the Democrats. I think he also, the Democrats were kind of wishy-washy on, worse than wishy-washy on immigration. And I think, Trump made toxic certain kinds of positions on immigration. Public opinion is more pro-immigrant today than it was before Donald Trump was elected. So, I think, he helped, we heard a lot of talk about norm erosion. He helped consolidate a lot of liberal norms throughout the society just because his name came to be attached to certain kinds of things that previously American society was kind of like, we want to restrict immigration. And now majority says, maybe not. That's Trump. That's fascism. So I think in that extent, actually, he's been, I think he's been a kind of clarifying, agent for many, for a lot of, I wouldn't say necessarily left-wing positions, but kind of liberal positions.
Right. But then, of course, he's like the opposite of Bernie Sanders, the equal opposite, in terms of that clarion, the moral clarity. Just whatever the opposite of Trump is becomes the clearly moral position. But then, of course, the danger is that the Dems will just, not we'll have like one fewer kid in a cage and then be like, but we're not Trump. Right. So that's
and I think that's, I've been watching very carefully. It hasn't gotten that much attention at all, but, Biden's moves on immigration are very much kind of like one step forward, two steps back. Right. And I'll be curious to see how much attention they get, given how much attention was focused on that issue under Trump. And of course, there's a really, sobering precedent, which is that a lot of the things, I mean, I remember this very clearly, that liberals and Democrats were extraordinarily upset about under George W. Bush. Once Barack Obama came in and took, some of those things over, you saw, a kind of, diminution in concern about that. But, I think if we could just pull back, just for 1 second, I mean, and what I really see happening here, the thing that concerns me the most at this point is that with the exception of Barack Obama's first 2 years in office, where he was actually able to accomplish quite a bit. I mean, people forget. But there was a flurry of legislation he was able to get through. And then it all came to a stop. And so that was in 2010 when it really came to a stop. From 2010 to today, we have been in a situation, I think, of paralysis, broadly bipartisan paralysis, where you have not seen big legislative advances of any kind of a policy agenda, whether on the left or the right. Trump ruled primarily through a series of executive orders, which Joe Biden is going to now undo and do his own version of executive orders. But he was not able to get legislation through. Barack Obama in the last 6 years of his presidency was not. And given the makeup of where we are right now, it doesn't look to me like necessarily Joe Biden is going to get that much done. And so I think, as I try to step back from the emotion of this moment, which, has been intense for understandable reasons, we are really in a kind of political wilderness here, where, neither side can advance a kind of political agenda. And so that means, sort of this ongoing neoliberal rot that continues, and where all you're doing is relying on these executive orders and hoping that somehow a president can deliver you from this paralysis. And that is not, given the scope of the challenges we're facing, that is not a good position to be in. And that's what I fear we are going to be in, is, sort of 2 to 4 more years of the same thing, where you just have this this toggling between a kind of neoliberal, white racist, ethno-nationalist party on the one hand, and then a neoliberal multicultural party on the other hand. And we're sort of stuck.
Woke neoliberalism. I do think that it's the heightening of the rhetorical game is very empowering of Democrats, of their worst tendencies, right? Because they don't actually have to challenge on a policy level as much as they would have to had Trump not been such a noxious, verbally toxic as well, and person. And then, of course, the other thing is that we can get into this later because this is not, but the foreign policy is an area where he was able to inflict a lot of damage. I guess he was more, he actually was also kind of hamstrung in that, right? Whenever he tried to take troops out, he would get called, I don't know, Putinist and.
Well, I mean, and sorry, just to jump in there, but we've already forgotten this because everything changes so quickly. But in December, he vetoed the National Defense Authorization Act. Now, previous presidents have vetoed those acts. Reagan did it, Clinton did it, George W. Bush did it. And Congress basically had to modify their position and accede to the terms of those vetoes. That didn't happen here. Trump was overridden on his veto. So, even in the realm of foreign policy, he got pushback, a lot of pushback, including from his own party. But I do think, nevertheless, I do think you're right that he was able to inflict material damage, both internationally and domestically. And I don't think that's ever been the question, in question, I should say.